Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is SC Coleman, author, and in this video we're going to talk about functionaries. Of course, there's a lot that goes into this particular concept and how things work. So the first thing we'll look at here in my notes is covering what a functionary is, essentially, and how the system works. Well, first thing we need to understand about functionaries is that they're inherent cowards, because functionaries are trained to be cowards, and in general, if someone is a functionary, it is out of cowardice that they are a functionary. It's the idea here is cultivated in a system where courage is specifically and especially penalized. Hence, you get a great deal of cowardice. There is an enforcement of a paramount rule of standards for the community. We've heard them before, community standards. And it really relates to this idea of a collectivist rule, an arbitrary equality, if you will. A rule or standard that is equal to all and arbitrarily enforced. Functionaries lack creativity, which is an inherent component of any free and individual point of contemplation. In order to be able to contemplate, you have to be an individual and free, and if you're involved in a groupthink, is the word for it, then you can't be that. You can't be contemplative and you can't be individual free, so there's also a lack of contemplative capability as well. Cognition is a word for it. The life of a functionary is comprised of ritualized social activities, hunting for antisocial behavior, and teaching others the rules of society. Sort of like, if I have to do it, you have to do it kind of thing. Most functionaries are not paid, but enforce collective standards under the maxim, we have to do it. Or it's for the best interests of the community, that sort of thing. Examples of a function or functionaries is yelling out the window about so-called traffic laws, harassing parents by constantly asking when will they put their child in school, which school, when, bringing up topics and engaging in histrionics to induce a hostile environment, to control behavior and gain attention. Arbitrary punishments as driving factors, speeding, fines versus death. Here, the idea is that in this collectivist standard rule system, you do something out of fear of an arbitrary punishment and not out of reality. So people don't speed because they're afraid of fines. So you remove speeding fines, you remove people off the road, like cops, etc. And all those functionaries will begin to speed and drive like crazy people. Because in their mind, the reason not to speed or otherwise drive really fast only has to do with the fine. Thus, they don't recognize death as a possible outcome of reckless driving, which is the original reason why you don't drive really fast or drive chaotically, is because you'll get into a bad wreck. Obviously, the more velocity you're moving, the worse the wreck will be, right? Same thing with oncoming traffic. You have oncoming traffic going the same speed, you're going the same speed, a front head-on collision is going to be a lot worse than, say, a fender bender. The reason why most people, I'd say, in the past anyway, did not speed or drive recklessly or chaotically was to avoid the consequence of reality, not to avoid fines. Another one is prosecution versus death. Many people will do dangerous things on purpose because they're more afraid of being quote-unquote prosecuted or quote going to jail than they are of the natural consequence to their behavior. And conversely, if prosecution is lifted as a threat, most of these functionaries will proceed to do illogical and extremely dangerous behavior because they do not have in their cognitive processing a recognition of reality and consequences that come from reality. Another idea is doing exercise for physical education grades, and this is essentially another reason why so many people today are unhealthy, because they don't focus on doing exercise and physical activity for the betterment of the body, to avoid having a broken body, but rather they focus on it to get good grades in school, and thus the individuals and collective creatures who set up that school system can obfuscate the actual purpose behind doing exercise, bettering yourself, making your body stronger, healthier, etc., and they can transition it to arbitrary collective standard regulations. Another one is the idea of signs versus safety, and that's becoming a big one today, because these little creature controllers are going around putting up signs which are causing safety hazards, they're causing dangerous situations, they're completely arbitrary, designed entirely for control and no other reason. Where in the past, many people might have been under the presumption that a sign is put there for safety reasons. Well, it's becoming more and more apparent today that safety has nothing to do with it. It's about control, implicitly, and the control, the measures of control by all means, or arbitrary controls, create safety hazardous situations. Function of collectivist standards control includes an extensive organized and marketing machine, control of information, behavior modification and learning outcomes, force reduction, and control. So all of this has to do essentially with propaganda. The first thing to notice, though, is that the extensive and organized marketing machine does not care about the content of what they market. They essentially have a position with which each and every one of the functionaries within their group will go around and promote what they're told to promote, right? So you see this with real estate billboards promoting the movie Barbie or Wicked or any of these other things. The people in that institution, all the functionaries, they do not care about what they're promoting. They simply promote what they're told to promote, and that is a large marketing machine, a function of the brainwashing and propaganda and information control. Of course, these functionaries, because they're enforcing collectivist standards, will also go around arbitrarily removing information, which is information control, also through the ideas of censorship, etc. Behavior modification and learning outcomes usually have to do with the fact that the functionaries want to find antisocial behavior, is what they call it, and then modify that behavior to induce the learning outcome of socialization or being social, right? But the main purpose behind it, of course, is this thing they call antisocial behavior, one of which is contemplation. So, of course, naturally, the functionaries have no cognitive capability or they don't contemplate anything. They simply act according to the collective standard and they feel stuff, but they don't think. Force reduction and control is a universal part of all the collectivist standards, where they bring down to a singular component the function of force that can be leveraged and controlled by the functionaries against any of those who, quote unquote, have antisocial behavior indications and things like that, or dangerous, what they call high-risk habits or something like that. Functionaries are trained to operate on the surface, where they are affected by storms and rough situations. Below the surface are the functions themselves, which make up currents and other driving movements. Only in the placid surface of water, like a lake or pond, can you see clearly, and when avoiding a wave, it is best to go underneath it. Collectivist standards taught in school but they are propagated by attorneys. So this is a very important point to recognize here, is that attorneys are the effective operators of this system because they write and propagate the collectivist standards, which are then picked up by the under-functionaries, the sub-functionaries, and carried out. Sure, the standard is collective behavior of following arbitrary rules and community standards and regulations that so-called apply equally to everyone. Sure, that's taught in the school system, but that comes out of, mainly speaking, the attorney apparatus. They're the ones that write all the manuals and the handbooks and everything. They don't write them themselves, of course, but they essentially make the rules. And in that context, every attorney is an enemy of any other type of idea, including the U.S. Constitution, because they effectively have an attorneys-only republic in which the attorneys legitimately rule by publishing opinions and, well, not the opinions, but publishing the regulations and rules which will apply to things like traffic and, where you travel, what you do, what you buy, all of that stuff, right? All of that comes from attorneys. There is no decision made today in any capacity without the input of an attorney, if it's in any way related to this collectivist standard that we call society. So when we're talking about revenue, which of course relates to the money, because that's the reason why, right? That what do you get attorneys to do it? Something we need to notice with the attorneys is they will create a situation in which they will gain their own revenue, right? So if the attorneys will write in programs, if you will, which will bring in construction workers. Then when there's a flood of construction workers in, suddenly all these billboards go up about if you're injured in an construction accident or something like that. So the attorneys, through the paperwork mechanism, virtually control all aspects of modern society. What we call developed or advanced society. So some of the forms of revenue, we can look at the main example, which covers just about everything today, which is the selling of an exception, a privilege. A privilege is when somebody makes a rule and then begins to sell the exception. Now, the exception could become the rule, but that rule is always there in the background. Renting and leasing is the selling of a privilege of use. License and a permit is the selling of the privilege of doing something. Title and position is the selling the privilege of a claim. You get to say you're something, basically. A home and car title is purchasing the right to claim ownership. It's not actually ownership. When you buy a car title or a home, you're purchasing the ability to say, I own it. You don't actually own it. You lease a license to music, which is then purchasing the right to use a song in a certain way. A driver's license and an identification is purchasing the permission to travel and buy things, right? Without an ID, regardless of how old you actually are or look or what your birth certificate says, you can't buy alcohol or cigarettes. They always have to see that ID. That is a collectivist standard that is enforced today arbitrarily, unlawfully, but it's enforced by the collective, meaning the majority of functionaries out there, mindlessly. There's no thought put into it. And it's all for fear of the same thing. Well, we could get shut down by the ATF or the health department, some other nonsense like that. Some other examples is ship bonding. This is an old example. This is when you were required to have a bond on a ship in order to. It probably is the same today, but that was a primary motivating factor in the War of 1776, in which the colonists were in fact enforcing the sovereignty of their charters, but then just came up with this whole constitutional concept after the charters, of course, were just scrapped, basically. But the charters gave them sovereignty. The charters didn't give them sovereignty. The charters declared their sovereignty. They were sovereign, and they had a sovereign system. They had incursions coming in from the Board of Trade, and most of that revolved around ship bonding. The requirement to have a bonded ship in order to deal and trade. And there's a lot of other things, but that was the main crux of it. The list on a venue, which is interesting for the word revenue or revenue. See, it's like venue is, most people understand it as a location or place, but revenue most people understand as incoming profit or something like that. So revenue would be what, a revenue? It's kind of weird. Either way, the lists on a venue. So, like if you go to a concert or something like that, the person who blocks entry is enforcing a list. It doesn't matter who's on that list. All that matters, or it doesn't matter the level of the person on that list, right? What their title is, etc., and all that stuff. Now, really good bouncers or gate people will recognize somebody of importance and just let them in regardless of what the list says, because if they don't, then it will cause a drama, right? A problem. However, most of the functionaries today, they will simply enforce the list, regardless of whether somebody was supposed to be on it but was deleted off it, or there was an error, or there's a double name, repeated name of someone. They will just enforce what the names on the list are. Period. That's it. If you're not on the list, you're not on the list, and that's tough luck. There's no way to appeal it or anything. That's how the functionaries work today, and that's how the functions work. If you go somewhere and you're either on the list or not on the list, there is effectively no form of fixing it, because everything's only and always about the control of everyone through collective enforcement of arbitrary standards. House, rent, purchase, and tax are all examples of revenue through privilege on property. A vehicle has many privileges sold about it. The docking of a boat on a marina. Now, the weird thing is that you can actually sell the privilege of office and functions, so where somebody actually purchases their position in a particular office or to carry out a particular function. And then, of course, there's awards and martial arts belts, and all of those things are purchased privileges. You purchase the privilege to wear it around and have a place to say, yes, this person achieved that. It's completely arbitrary, right? It's all part of the collectivist standards control. It has nothing to do with individual freedom. It has everything to do with grouping everyone together to become functionaries of a function and carry it out mindlessly like any type of computer program. As some examples of alternative revenue streams include fees and fines, which is paying someone to do something, or not to do something. So when you get a fine, you pay them not to do something. When you get a fee, you pay them to do something. Membership is also a privilege, which includes the joining of a group, paying to join a group, right? Then you have direct to customer, which is what most people know of revenue, and that's about the end of it. Most people, I'd say, know about direct to customer, and that's it. That's selling a product or service directly to a customer, right? Convenience of acquisition is the main focus that we find on direct to customer sales, which includes shipping, stores that could be online or it could be brick and mortar. And there's many other similar, like going door to door and et cetera, all those types of things. There's other similar forms of the convenience of acquisition in the direct customer sales technique for revenue. Some forms of finance, which I haven't fleshed this out, but finance does not involve returns in actuality. Monetary returns, right? Return on investment, for instance, ROI. Finance is more like where you choose to put your money or revenue. It comes from the French finir. Finir. Is it finir? That might be Spanish. Either way, it's the term in French for to end something. Like finance is the end of the road for the money, basically, because it comes in and goes through all of these things and whatnot, and then it ends up here, right? That's the idea, is that when you finance something, you're putting it there. It's ending up there. So that's the important aspect with those. Now this next piece of information is, I haven't been able to get through this whole document, but I felt that this preliminary information was important enough to include in the video. Here we have a prospectus for this first part's not that important. So this is Prosus NV. NV is a company designated for the Netherlands. Incorporated in the Netherlands, a U.S. $12 billion global medium-term note program. Under this U.S. $12 billion global medium note program, the program Prosus NV may from time to time issue notes denominated in any currency agreed between the issuer and the relevant dealers as defined below. So they're printing money in USD, or U.S. dollar notes. They're printing U.S. dollars, essentially, by another means. Minimum denominations of 200,000 and multiples of 1,000. This lists a Euronext Dublin and an official list. We were talking about collectivist lists and all that stuff. A security rating is not a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold securities and may be subject to suspension, reduction, or withdrawal at any time by the assigning rating agency. Tranches of notes issued under the program will be rated or unrated. Where a tranche of notes is rated, such tranche will not be necessarily be the same as the ratings assigned to the program by the rating agencies. Where a tranche of notes is rated, the applicable ratings will be specified in the relevant pricing supplement or drawdown prospectus as applicable. Security rating is not a recommendation to buy, sell, or blah blah blah. So here's some interesting names we have here. Is the Depository Trust Company, DTC. Now you notice that's called a trust company for deposit, a depository trust company. Yet they talk about this depository trust company as though it were some type of sanctified governmental agency, right? They essentially make many of the regulations. Registered in the name of Seed & Co. That's Charlie Echo Delta Echo. New safekeeping structure, NSS. Euroclear Bank SA-NV/NV. Clearstream Banking SA, Clearstream Luxembourg, Euroclear, and DTC Clearing Systems. So those are clearing systems. Now the arranger here is listed as Citigroup, and this is dated December 16th, 2021. This mentions qualified institutional buyers, and also mentions something called no adverse change. It's an interesting word to use, adverse change, right? Program limit. The maximum aggregate principal amount of notes outstanding at any one time under the program will not exceed US $12 billion, and for this purpose, any notes denominated in another currency shall be translated into US dollars at the date of the agreement to issue such notes. The maximum aggregate principal amount of notes that may be outstanding and guaranteed at any time under the program may increase from time to time, subject to compliance with relevant provisions of the distribution agreement as defined under subscription and sale. Alright, just got a table of contents. We're just going to skip over that. No need to read all of that right there. And here we get to the really interesting bit. Tencent's performance will have a material impact on our results of operations on an economic interest basis and our financial condition. As of September 30th, 2021, we held a 28.86% effective interest in Tencent Holdings Limited, Tencent, representing 54% of our total assets on a carrying value basis as that date. Our share of Tencent's revenue on an economic interest basis represented 77% of our total revenue during FY 2021. And 74% of our total revenue for the 6 months ended September 30th, 2021. We have committed not to sell any further our Tencent shares for the next 3 years following our sale of shares in April 2021. The fair share of our value interest in Tencent is volatile and subject to fluctuations in the market value of Tencent's ordinary shares, which are listed on the main board of the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. a market operated by the Stock Exchange of Hong Kong Limited, the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. For example, from January 1st, 2021 through November 30th, 2021, the price of Tencent's ordinary shares has ranged from a high of HK 775.50 on February 18th, 2021 to a low of 412 HK and 20 cents on August 2nd or 20th, 2021. As of November 30th, 2021, our 28.86% interest in Tencent has worth approximately US 163 billion. Based on the share price of HK 459.40 on November 30th, 2021, and an exchange rate of blah blah blah. Okay, so that's not particularly important. The most important part here is this part. As Tencent's business and operations are substantial in the mainland of China, its business, the market price of its shares, and ability to pay dividends may be influenced to a significant degree by economic, political, and social conditions in the mainland China generally, including weak economic growth or recession in the mainland of China, as well as the regulatory environment. And another thing to note here, well, I'll get to that in a minute, actually. So, other than the online game industry, Tencent operates several other highly regulated businesses subject to a number of laws and regulations, including those governing online mobile financing products and cloud services. Tencent conducts its value-added telecommunications business in the mainland of China through certain domestic companies that are licensed to operate these services, the OpCos. Although Tencent does not own any equity interest in these OpCos, through a series of contractual arrangements, together the structured contracts, Tencent exercises effective control over these OpCos and receives substantially all economic benefit of the businesses, in the form of consulting, licensing, revenue sharing, technical support, and other fees. Right? Like I said, alternative revenue sources. And in this case, alternative control. If the structured contracts were found to violate PRC laws, this could have a material adverse effect on Tencent's operations. That's more of a warning, as in, make sure it doesn't happen, so to speak. This is coming from the mouth of the finance controllers, who believe themselves to be the financial arm of so-called law. Business models, most of our businesses include those in the classifieds, food delivery, payments, and fintech, edtech, and e-tail segments, typically require scale to achieve profitability. That means a lot of people, right, everywhere. As scale creates a significant user base to generate and sustain network effects. Well, there's your sustainability word. Our businesses, particularly our consumer lending and financial service businesses in the payments and fintech segment, process a large volume of personal data, including user identity and contact information, transaction data, including records of purchases and payment method data, including credit card information, analytics, and other confidential business partner, customer, and employee information. Following the group's sale of 191,890,000 shares in Tencent, or approximately 2% of Tencent's issued share capital, on April 2021, we hold a 28.9% effective interest in Tencent. That doesn't really matter because they control it in a different way. We focus our investments on markets that we believe represent significant growth opportunities in terms of gross domestic product, GDP, demographics, middle class, and population, as well as high-speed internet and mobile penetration and adoption of new internet-based business models. That's exactly what you want a massive Chinese organization to be involved in, right? Operating obviously under the cover or facilitated through this Dutch company. So essentially you'll have Dutch companies come into the United States and other types of European companies, and really they're just a front for the Chinese system. But the important thing to notice is that it's not the Chinese, quote unquote, doing it. It's the fact that China is a utopia of collectivist control and arbitrary regulation, in which they can effectively leverage a massive workforce of mindless drones and can carry out wide and expansive propaganda efforts, all being filtered through a Dutch company, which the Dutch company is the one that actually controls those elements, right? So that's the important thing to do. And they would want you to be like, oh, look, it's China doing it. No, actually, it's not. And if you think it's trying to do it, then you're going to miss the person who's the cover middleman for it. Well, and also the operator, the one really behind it. We rely in part on search engines such as Google and mobile operating systems such as Android and iOS and their respective application marketplaces to direct new and existing users to our platforms and to facilitate downloads of our mobile apps. Our payments and fintech segment relies upon relationships with acquirers and other partners, and in Poland, where we act as an acquirer, the international card networks such as Visa and MasterCard are local sponsors to provide payment services if we are unable to maintain our relationships with acquirers, or where we act as an acquirer. Our access to the international card networks, we would face significant difficulty in offering many of our payment services, which would result in the loss of certain customer relationships and negatively impact our revenue. We rely on a number of experienced employees with detailed knowledge of our business and the markets in which we operate. Unanticipated losses of key employees or the inability to identify, attract, and retain qualified personnel in the future could adversely affect our business operations. That sounds like a pretty easy point of failure and weakness for this institution. Several of our financing arrangements, including our US $2.5 billion multi-currency revolving credit facility, the revolving credit facility, contain financial covenants and other ongoing undertakings and requirements. The availability of amounts under the revolving credit facility is subject to financial covenants requiring us and our consolidated subsidiaries to at all times maintain a ratio of net debt as defined below to value as defined below that does not exceed 20%. We prepare our financial statements in accordance with International Financial Reporting Standards, IFRS, as adopted by the European Union. So there's your international globalist collective standards and arbitrary rules. In the United States, effective February 2020, the scope of FDI review by the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States was expanded to cover not only transactions that result in foreign control of U.S. businesses, but also non-controlling investments in U.S. businesses involved in certain sensitive sectors, including those involving critical technology or sensitive personal data of U.S. citizens. On July 26, 2019, the Russian State Duma introduced a new draft law, the SIR bill, which, if enacted, would, among other things, restrict the ability of foreign shareholders and affiliates to individually or collectively own, manage, to control directly or indirectly more than 20% of the shares of an entity that owns a significant information source, SIR being certain websites, web pages, information systems, and/or software. To our knowledge, a certain number of PRC internet companies, including Tencent, adopt a variable interest entity structure, VI, or V, but there have been few precedents where internet companies with a V structure or VI structure were investigated for being involved in the concentration of undertakings until recently. Of course, that's the French word for life, c'est la vie, right? VIE, Victor India Echo. It is the French word for life, and they are calling a company a life structure. I don't know what is with these people and their weird, twisted belief system that they can simply manufacture life out of thin air. But a company is not a living being, regardless of how much they want to call it a creature, organism, or, it's just strange. Their obsession with making a company or corporation a living being. On October 8, 2021, the OECD issued a statement with an update on the status of global negotiations and reforming international tax system. What is the international tax system? That's something that's interesting. This statement builds on the earlier statement released on July 1st, 2021 and is supported by 137 out of the 141 participating countries in the G20 OECD Inclusive Framework Program, Pillar 1 of the plan aims to ensure a fair distribution of profits and taxing rights among countries, regardless of whether firms have a physical presence in the countries where they generate revenues. That's called theft. The measures of Pillar 1 will only apply to the largest and most profitable multinational enterprises, of course. Pillar 2 seeks to put a floor on competition over corporate income tax through the introduction of a global minimum corporate tax rate of 15%. In the coming months, the plan is to address the open issues so that the new rules can start having effect in 2023. In addition, there is a high-level commitment on the abolishment of existing digital services tax and agreement not to introduce new digital services taxes, i.e. taxes on certain revenue streams of digital companies such as search engine, social media, and online marketplace company, which derive value from users in a relevant taxation jurisdiction, going forward also beyond 2023. So that gives you an idea of how this so-called inflation has been manufactured. The executive order entitled Securing Information and Communications Technology and Services Supply Chain, Executive Order 13873, was issued on May 15, 2019. Executive Order 13873 authorizes U.S. Secretary of Commerce to prohibit or condition information and communication technology transactions with entities under the jurisdiction of a foreign adversary, as that term has been defined by the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, which names the PRC as a foreign adversary jurisdiction. The U.S. Department of Commerce promulgated regulations to implement provisions of Executive Order 13873. However, the U.S. Department of Commerce may revise and issue a different final rule. And I'm sure they did that, because they're all traders, and it's very obvious when you have the People's Republic of China listed as a foreign adversary, and yet everything has that stamp made in China. I mean, come on, it's just a joke. So of course an executive order gets put out, and every agency immediately, if it doesn't run in line with the plans of the globalists, will find a way to circumnavigate it, otherwise or construe it in a way that they don't get in trouble with their global overlords. In addition, the executive order issued on January 19, 2021, entitled Taking Additional Steps to Address the National Emergency with Respect to Significant Malicious Cyber-Enabled Activities, Executive Order 13984. To date, the U.S. Secretary of Commerce has not promulgated regulations to implement Executive Order 13984, but issued an advance notice of proposed rulemaking published in the U.S. Federal Register in September 24, 2021. Yeah, that sounds about right. If regulations are implemented pursuant to Executive Order 13984, Tencent's cloud services and transactions with U.S. IaaS providers may be adversely impacted. Yeah, no crap. On June 3rd, 2021, President Biden issued Executive Order 14032, revising and superseding Executive Order 13959, as amended, which had prohibited U.S. persons from transacting in publicly traded securities of designated communist Chinese military companies, as well as securities derivative or designed to provide investment exposure to such securities. Executive Order 14032 largely retains the same prohibitions as Executive Order 13959, but replaces Executive Order 13959's criteria for designation in its entirety and places the authority to make designations with the U.S. Treasury Secretary. Executive Order 14032 extends the designation criteria of Executive Order 13959 to include not only companies determined to operate or which have operated in the defense and related material sector of China's economy, but also those determined to operate or to have operated in the surveillance technology sector of China's economy. The U.S. Department of the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control maintains a list of entities designated pursuant to the U.S. Department of the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control. Oh wait, I already read that. Executive Order 14032, known as the Non-SDN Chinese Military Industrial Complex Companies List, which replaced the prior CCMC list in its entirety. Although to date none of Tencent's products, services, and transactions have been prohibited as a result of the implementation of any of the above executive orders, what a surprise, there can be no assurance that these executive orders would not have an adverse effect on the operation of Tencent's business in the future, particularly if these executive orders are specifically implemented against its products or services in the United States. There is also no assurances that the United States will not issue additional executive orders or other laws, regulations that may adversely affect Tencent's business and financial conditions. As of September 30, 2021, Naspers holds 56.9% of Prosus ordinary shares N and 100% of the Prosus ordinary shares B, which on a combined basis represents 72.7% of the voting rights of Prosus as a result of cross-holding between Prosus and Naspers, which is governed by a cross-holding agreement. The economic interest attributable to Naspers is 40.9%. Naspers has significant control over our management and affairs and controls all matters requiring approval by our shareholders, including the election, removal of directors, and approval of any significant corporate transactions such as merger or other sales of our assets. We have a protection structure under our Articles of Association, whereby upon Naspers making or being obliged to make a filing with Staatliche Autorität Finanzielle Markten, that it ceases to be entitled to exercise at least 50% plus one vote of the total number of voting rights that may be exercised at a general meeting. The protection structure will be activated, and the A1 ordinary shares carrying one vote per share will automatically convert to A2 ordinary shares carrying 1,000 votes per share. The majority of the A ordinary shares are held by two companies, Naspers Beleggings RF Limited, NASBEL, and Keromstrat 30 Beleggings RF Limited, Kirum, that together also comprise the voting structure of Naspers. Nebel and Kirum collectively hold 79.95% of the A ordinary shares, with, if the protected structure is activated, will carry more than 50% of the total voting rights of the ordinary shares. In that case, Nasbel and Kirum will together directly control matters requiring approval by our shareholders. Naspers, Nasbel, and Kirum individually or together may have interests that differ from your interests as a holder of the notes, and may vote in a way that is adverse to your interest as a holder of the notes. So here you get a good idea about how the effective workings are going. You have a corporate entity structure which is termed as having life, and runs this kind of checks and balances machine to institute economic decline, economic attack, and a robust control of information and propagation of propaganda. It is Chinese, but is listed as Dutch. Now, I think that's amazing myself, and I should probably take a note of where exactly I marked that, because this is how large the document is. It's huge. And the front, I don't think I've actually gotten into the structural purposes and other types of details that might be contained in that document. It's hard to work through, it takes time. But I think the main point to cover there is exactly how this is how things are going, and that the main things they're worried about is loss of, quote, key personnel, right? And loss of control. So they have this advanced thing they're proud of with how they retain control, and they can keep operational controls through alternative means, right? All their contracts and their voting structure and everything like that. But it leads to the mind of these people is that control to them is life. Life is control. If you don't have control, you don't have any life. That's how they look at it. It's very weird to think, because it's, in most cases, it's unnatural and very difficult for even the advanced cognitive thinkers among humanity to be able to comprehend. That's a very strange outlook, that control is life. Right? It's not the breath, it's not the blood, it's not the moving parts and all that. It's control, the control itself. That is what life is. It's very strange.